Okay, this is the installation instruction video series for the Honda EU3000is generator for my long-range remote control system. This particular generator is an older one. It is a non-California approved version, but the installation of the wireless remote control system is identical for the California approved versus the non-California approved models. At any rate, installation, straightforward and simple. Go ahead and open up the side panel on it. Then remove the front and rear covers. Front cover is held on with 4 acorn nuts. Notice the flange on the acorn nuts is fairly large for the acorn nut that goes into the plastic cover. The acorn nuts that hold this small metal cover on the bottom have a much smaller flange. It doesn't hurt it if you get the two confused, but it doesn't look nice either. You remove the 4 acorn nuts and then slide the cover off. When you get the cover off, number one, make sure that the 4 spacers, they look like this, are still in the cover. Sometimes they'll stick to the generator. Second item is make sure that the foam gasket is in this groove, and it goes all the way around the front and rear cover. If the foam gasket has fallen out of the groove, go ahead and put it back in before reinstalling it. The rear cover is also held on with 4 acorn nuts. Okay, the rear cover, the foam gasket has come out of the groove, so we'll put that back in place. And the next thing, this stud came off with the acorn nut. So what I'm going to do is, now that I can get at the shoulder for it from behind, I'll remove the acorn nut from the stud and reinstall the stud into the back of the generator. The side with the hex shoulder faces out, the side with the flange faces the generator. And I'll merely screw that back into place where it's supposed to stay. Next, here at the rear, we'll remove the grill from the top of the muffler. Set the grill aside. Next, I'll remove the lower panel. The lower panel and the upper grill are held on with the exact same size bolts. They're a 6mm bolt. Of course, the head on is a 10mm. The only difference is the bolts that hold this lower panel are painted black. If you do get them mixed up, it will not harm anything. It'll just look odd to have silver bolts holding this black panel on. And that's probably as good a place as any to take a break. Okay, the next step will be to remove the lift handle from the back of the generator. The lift handle is held on with 8mm bolts, so of course they have a 12mm head on them. Now the back fiberglass cover that covers the muffler can be removed. And that simply slides back at the top. Then you spread the bottom feet. Just slide it out of the way. And we come around the front of the generator. The next item will be to remove the fuel selector valve. We're going to remove the fuel selector valve knob so we can pull the control panel off. For that, use a long number 2 screwdriver, Phillips head. Remove the knob. Then we're going to remove the airbox lid and the air filter. You may need the flashlight. There are 4 clamps right here. Fold the clamps up out of the way. Remove the lid for the airbox. Then remove the air filter and set those out of the way. And that's probably as good a place as any to take a short break. Okay, the next item to be removed is going to be the airbox itself. The first step is to remove the breather hose from the fitting on the corner of the airbox. Then the airbox is held on by 2 nuts on 6mm studs and 1 6mm bolt in the bottom corner. And again, the 6mm bolts will have a 10mm head on them. And just slide the rest of the airbox out of the way. Next item to be removed is going to be the control panel itself, and it's held on by 4 10mm bolts, one at each corner. If it makes it easier for you when you're disassembling the generator, put all the fasteners in their own separate location, or to lay it out on a workbench or a floor, whichever way makes the most sense to you. Go ahead and do that. Now before we slide the control panel out, you'll notice the choke cable runs behind the fuel selector valve. So I'm going to go ahead and push the spring right here out of the way so we can disengage the choke cable. And then push the choke cable down below the fuel selector valve to give us a little bit of room to work. There. When we drop the choke cable down below the fuel selector valve, now the control box folds out and down. So at this point, you can see the back of the control panel, and this is where most of the work is going to be done. First item, there is a 6-pin connector. It goes to the ignition switch. The ignition switch is visible right here in the front. If you look at the back of it, you can see it right below the main harness. Disconnect the 6-pin connector and take the harness from the ignition switch and route it up out of the way. I'm going to go ahead and completely remove the ignition switch from the generator for this next step. It is not critical that you remove the ignition switch from the generator completely. It just makes it a lot easier to videotape it. If you do decide to remove the ignition switch completely, it's called an antenna nut socket, but you can do it either, an antenna nut. You can loosen it up either with a large pair of pliers or an antenna nut socket. But the retaining ring just screws on. Then there's a small white insulator right here, and that goes on the outside. Then if you just lift up on the wiring harness, the ignition switch comes out in one piece. And that's probably as good a place as any to go ahead and take a break. Okay, if you look at the back of the stock ignition switch, you'll see that the position of each of the wires is numbered. And there's a blue wire that is on position number 2. We need to remove the blue wire from position number 2 and solder it to this tab, which is position number 6. You'll see a small number 6 next to it. So we just heated it up a little bit and the solder melted away. And now we're going to go ahead and move it to the number 6 position. What we'll do is we'll bend it around in a circle and we'll heat up that tab. If you need to add extra solder, go for it. This particular one looks like there's enough solder on it. We can heat it up and put it in place. Okay. You can see that the blue wire has now been removed from position number 2 and put in position number 6. Now we'll go ahead and reinstall the ignition switch. You'll notice that there is a tab on the bottom of the ignition switch. That's simply to index it. so that the key will be in the right position when it's in the off position or on position or start position. You'll see on the outer housing that that little tab goes into a slot that's in the 5 o'clock position, right down here. Then you put the white insulator ring on it, and then the antenna nut. And then we'll snug it down just snug. And that's probably as good a place as any to take a break for a moment. Okay, do not plug the ignition switch back in at this time. I'll come later. The kit includes a piece of Velcro. Take the Velcro piece and remove the backing, and then stick the Velcro to the end of the control box, right here. If you'll come in, you'll see where the 2 bolt holes that the bolts go through to locate the control box to the generator base. Try to center it vertically between those 2 bolts. Then take the radio that comes with the kit. You notice that the radio already has a piece of Velcro corresponding stuck to the back of that. Take the radio and push it up tight against this flange and center it right between these 2 bolts, and then push it in place so that the radio is now even with the front cover, and vertically it's centered between where these 2 bolts are going to go. Taking a test fit is a nice idea. Take the antenna wire, and just to keep it out of place for now, the antenna is a magnetic base. Go ahead and stick it to the top of the fuel tank. You'll see the antenna wire is draped loosely out of the way. Later on it will be routed correctly. Take the wiring harness and loop it around to where it follows the main harness in to the back of the control box. You'll have 1 white wire with a female bullet connector, and that'll hang outside the control box. It's a double lit back, so it hangs outside the control box. Then take the black wire with the ring terminal and keep it outside the control box. What I do is just put the wires in a nice gentle arc, and then use zip ties included in the kit to zip tie them to the main harness. And that simply keeps it organized so that during the rest of the assembly you can see where everything is and it's not getting in your way. So 1 zip tie down here does the trick for that. Then you'll notice that there are 2 plugs on the radio kit that correspond to the ignition plug. The ignition plug I'm going to route it under the main harness because you'll see that there is a recessed area down here that we can tuck the wires into. So I'm going to route the ignition switch plug underneath this main harness here and plug it in to this harness. Like so. And just look at the locking tab on it. Make sure that the locking tab has locked correctly in place. Then I'm going to take that and push this into the recessed area right here to where it's out of the way. Then take the wiring harness that used to plug into the ignition switch and plug it in to the corresponding plug on the radio harness. And again, squeeze it until the locking tab plugs in. And I'm going to take that and I'm going to tuck it right down here. All the wires have a little bit of extra length to them. It's always easier to install the kit if the wires are a little too long, because you can route the wires out of the way somewhere, and if the wires are slightly too short, there's nothing you can do about it. So on this kit, I'm going to go ahead and pull some of the excess wire to where it's outside the control box. That way the wire that's inside the control box is a lot easier to tuck out of place. So now you have a tan wire going to the relay and 2 yellow wires. I'm going to go ahead and put an additional zip tie around these just to hold everything in place neatly. And that'll be zip tying the radio's harness to the main wiring harness. And then I will cut the end of the zip tie. And that's probably as good a place as any to take a break for a moment. Okay. Now you've got 2 yellow wires that are coming out of the radio. You notice one has a simple splice connector on it. The other has a .187 spade terminal on it. If you go to the back of the economy mode switch, there is a green wire with a white tracer. Unplug it from the back of the economy mode switch and take the yellow wire that has the .187 spade connector and plug it onto the back of the economy mode switch, right where you removed the green wire with the white tracer from. Then take the green wire with the white tracer and cut the .187 spade connector that was on it off. Then strip about 7 to 8 millimeters of insulation off the end of the green wire of the white tracer. Take the splice connector, fit that in, and crimp that together. And then you can tuck those right down next to the main harness as well. And that takes care of the economy mode function on it. And now you have a relay, and this relay is going to be used to control the outlet. The easiest way to do the outlet is to just remove the outlet from the control panel itself. And that's done with 2 Phillips head screws, one in the top and one in the bottom. Be careful not to drop the nut. It's on the inside. That would be the top screw. There's the bottom nut. Then you can lift the outlet out of the generator housing, or out of the control box housing, so you can get at it. You'll see that there is a large red wire that runs from the 20 amp circuit breaker to the outlet. So what we're going to do is we're going to loosen the Phillips head screw that large red wire is held in place with. You'll see that the red wire has an open ring terminal on it. We're just temporarily going to hold that out of place. You'll notice that there's a jumper that runs from one screw to the other one, right through here. This jumper has to be removed from the side where you removed the red wire earlier. You notice I have removed the jumper now. There used to be two little bands across here. I removed them earlier because unfortunately this is not the first take on this video segment. But at any rate, you'd remove the little jumper that used to go in here. And now, take the red wire and push it back on to that Phillips head screw. And coming out of the relay, there's a red wire and a blue wire with open ring terminals on them too. Take the red wire and slide it next to the stock red wire so that you will have two red wires on one screw, and tighten that screw down. Can you see it clearly? There are now two red wires. One comes from my relay, the other was stock. Then loosen the bottom screw and put the blue wire from the relay onto it, like so. And as you can clearly see, now the current path, instead of going through the jumper, goes through the relay so that you can turn it on or off. And that's probably as good a place as any to take a short break. Okay, now that you have the red wire and the blue wire attached to the outlet and the jumper removed, we'll go ahead and push the outlet back down into the stock location. Now when you're reinstalling the screws, put the bottom one in first. And you just feed the screw from the bottom in, and we'll put the nut onto the end of the screw. The easiest way to do this is to hold the nut in place with a fingertip and loosely thread the screw from the other side, so that now your bottom screw is in place. And now the reason that I recommend doing the bottom screw first is the top screw. You'll notice there's a fourth wire coming from the relay, and it's a black wire with a ring terminal on it. The top screw is also going to go through that ring terminal. So what we'll do, we'll push the top screw through the hole where the outlet goes, and we'll lay that last black wire onto the screw, and then we'll put the nut in place. Snug it down, and then go back to the bottom screw, which is still merely finger tight, and snug it down. Okay, now take the relay and find an area that's not congested to tuck it into. And right down here at the bottom, between the two outlets, looks like as good a place as any. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take another one of the ties included in the kit and tie wrap the wires from the relay to the main harness. And we'll cut the end of that tie wrap off. And over here I'll take the tan and the two yellows and tie wrap that to the main harness. So now just check and make sure that there are no wires that look like they're being pinched or look like they could get pinched when you put the main control box back together again. Everything looks like it's in good shape. So being careful not to tear the antenna wire or anything else. Incidentally, you'll notice when we had the control box folded out, the white wire from the starter got pulled loose. Don't concern yourself with that yet. We'll put that back together later. Well, we're going to go ahead and put the control box back into place. Make sure everything looks nice. I'm only going to put the top two bolts loosely onto the control box at this time. And those are the silver-headed 6mm bolts. So we've got the top one on the left side and the top one on the right side just threaded in loosely. Now, if you take a flashlight, shine it in this side, you'll see that the choke cable is no longer behind the fuel selector valve. So what we'll do, come around the front, make sure everything's lined up there. Then we'll just take the choke cable right here and push it back to the stock position. So now you see that the choke cable goes in through the front of the control panel, is routed around behind the fuel shutoff valve, and then comes around right here. We're going to leave it setting disconnected right now because one of the next steps is going to be to hook up the choke mechanism. I just wanted to point out that the choke cable needs to go behind the fuel selector valve, otherwise it'll become entangled. That's probably as good a place as any to take a short break. Okay, now if you come back over to the starter motor, there is a black wire that's tucked back in here, right next to the white one that got pulled loose on us. The black wire starts at the battery post and then goes up to the control or the starter motor. Unplug the black wire. Included in the kit is a blue wire with a female 4mm bullet connector and a male 4mm bullet connector, and then a ring terminal. Take the male 4mm bullet connector from the black wire that goes to the battery, plug that in to the female bullet connector of the blue wire included in the kit, and make sure you push it all the way in towards a nice good tight snap. Then take the male 4mm bullet and plug it into the 4mm female bullet on the black wire to the starter motor, and push that in till you feel a nice firm snap. And then take the white wire that got pulled loose on us earlier and go ahead and plug that back together. And you should also feel a nice firm snap. Okay, this one here, I can tell why it pulled loose, because when I plugged it back together it did not make a nice firm click. So I'm going to take the end of it and just squeeze that female connector just a little bit tighter, so that this time when I plug it together it makes a nice audible click when it snaps together. And then take the white wire, tuck it back in where it belongs. Take the black wire plugged into the blue wire and tuck that back in there. And now the ring terminal that's on the blue wire goes around the bottom bolt that holds the control box in place. That's why I did not bolt that bolt on earlier. So you'll feed it through the bottom bolt. And you'll thread it down, not tight yet. Then you take the last bolt, and you remember the black wire and white wire that we kept outside the control box. Black wire has a ring terminal on it. The bottom bolt on this side, you'll feed through the ring terminal. Start to tighten this down. Incidentally, if the radio is in such a position that it interferes with you, remember that you put the radio on with Velcro. So if you need to remove it, you can. In fact, it's probably easier to demonstrate what I'm doing here. Now I'll go ahead and tighten down all 4 screws. Excuse me, all 4 bolts. Now that all 4 of those bolts are tightened down, I'll go ahead and position the radio right back into place. You'll notice the antenna wire on the radio is running inside this stud. Incidentally, this is a shielded cable on the antenna wire. You can route it any way you'd like, but under no circumstances should you ever attempt to cut it and resolder it back together. If you cut it and resolder it back together, you're going to change the length of the wire, and it is a tuned length, and you're going to cause problems that way. And also, if you go to solder it back together and you get the outer shield soldered to the inner conductor, it'll totally mess up the antenna. So again, we're going to lay this wire out of place, or out of the way for right now, and stick the magnetic base to the top of the fuel tank. Okay. Now if you come around to the back of the generator, the reason we have removed the back covers is so that we can get at this flange, right where the exhaust manifold is bolted on, and you can see I've already drilled 2 holes. The reason I've drilled 2 holes is again because this is not the first take on this video. There's a temperature sensor. What you'll need to do is simply place the temperature sensor on this sheet metal flange and move it as far away from the stud and nut on the exhaust manifold as you can. I don't know if you need more light on that or not, but mark where the holes go and then drill 1/8 inch holes. And this temperature sensor will then screw into place. way I'm doing it is putting just a screw in the top hole because it's kind of hard to get at. In the bottom hole, I'm putting one of the mount screws through the ring terminal and into the bottom mount tab. Then tighten both the screws down. And I'm going to take the tab that the ring terminal is screwed to and bend that up just a little bit, just to make sure that it does not actually touch the stud from the exhaust manifold. And that's probably as good a place as any to take a break for a moment. Okay, once you get the temperature sensor bolted to the sheet metal flange, you'll take the female bullet connector and route it right between the rubber insulator boot and the outer engine sleeve. If you come around this way, you can see it a whole lot better. There's a rubber boot that's connected to this back flange and just pushes against this one. Route the wire right into this area, and as you can see, this generator already has one of my fuel kits installed on it. If you come around the back here, this white wire that's connected to the female boot or female connector, just make sure that it doesn't rub up tight against anything, because if it rubs up tight against anything and shorts out, then it's going to choke all the time when you've got the starter engaged. Right now, it's only going to choke when the engine temperature is below 115 degrees, below 115 degrees and the starter is engaged. Fortunately, these EU3000 generators will actually start fine even if they are being choked. But if you choke a hot motor, it's going to load up a little bit and run rough when you first start it up, so that's why I've got the temperature sensor on it, so that if it doesn't need choke, it won't choke it. Okay, the next step is going to be mounting the solenoid that closes the choke. And that'll be mounted to the back of the airbox. The procedure for that is, if you'll notice, there are little clips in the back of the airbox that are used for routing the emissions hoses on the California approved model. All the airboxes have these clips, whether it's a California approved generator or not. There's also a clip just like these two up here in the top of the airbox. On this one, I had cut it off earlier during research to try and come up with a better way, but at any rate, included in the kit is a 1/4-inch bolt, 2 washers, and a nylock nut. You'll take one of the 1/4-inch or one of the washers and place it like on this clip. You'll put it up tight against the clip and then push it down. But it would be in this location, so you'd push it tight against this clip and even with the top surface of the airbox. And once it's in place, first drill a 1/8 inch pilot hole, and that's holding the washer this way against the hose retainer and this way where the top of the washer is even with the top of the airbox. So then go ahead and drill a 1/8 inch pilot hole. Once you got the 1/8 inch pilot hole drilled, put a 1/4 inch drill bit in the drill and drill the hole out to 1/4 of an inch. And being that it is a plastic airbox, you'll have a little bit of slag material on it, but fortunately the slag material is not going to damage anything whatsoever. In fact, I don't recommend drilling it out oversized. If it were a metal airbox, then you'd have to drill the hole slightly larger than a 1/4 inch, for the 1/4-inch bolt to go through it. But the plastic, when you screw the 1/4-inch bolt in there, it'll actually form its own threads in there as you go. Next step is to remove the plunger from the solenoid body. Then take the metal clip that has a short section of rubber on it. Make sure that the short section of rubber is in this position. Let's turn so you can see it in the light better. And there is a crimp on the top of the clamp. You'll slide the solenoid body into the clamp from the back side, so that when it's in a position where it's shaped like the letter P, the threaded portion of the solenoid body will be facing you. Then from this end, put one of the washers onto the 1/4-inch bolt. And fit the 1/4-inch bolt through the 2 halves of the clamp. Then take a 7/16" socket and a 1/4-inch ratchet. And put the bolt through the hole that you just drilled in the last step. Then on the inside, you'll take the other washer, fit it over the end of the bolt, and a nylock nut, and fit it over the end of the bolt. Take a 7/16" end wrench, put it over the head of the bolt, take your ratchet with your 7/16 socket, and tighten the nut down from the inside. And now, sight along this surface here, and the top of the solenoid body should be parallel. So if this is the surface of the top of the airbox, the solenoid body should be perfectly parallel to it, not angled like this. And then sight straight down from the top and look at your surface of your airbox body and make sure that the solenoid is parallel in this way. You don't want it angled. If you need to rotate it this way, that's pretty easy to pivot on the bolt. So now it's parallel. This way, it will twist. This one's already parallel, but this is a thin strap of metal, so if it does not align correctly, take it and twist it. It will twist. It's not that hard. It's not that stiff of metal. So now the solenoid is mounted to the back of the airbox. Now if you come back over to the generator, okay. Actually, that's probably as good a place as any to take a break for a minute. As I had stated earlier, there's a crimp in these clamps, but I neglected to mention the reason for that crimp is that when you're sliding the body of the solenoid in, the main body will hit that crimp and stop, so that now when the bolt is tightened down, it will not slide any further into the clamp, because this, when the solenoid is energized, it should pull the plunger in as opposed to pulling the solenoid body this way. And that's it. On the carburetor, there's a spacer plate. And slide the whole carburetor and the choke bracket out just about to the end of the studs. Then if you slide the choke bracket out to where it's off the end of the studs and lift up on it gently, you'll see that this pin comes off with the choke bracket. I'm pulling this apart this particular time because of the fact that the choke cable slid out of the bracket, and it's a lot easier to get it back in if you pull the whole thing out. If your choke cable, which would be this part right here, does not slide out of this bracket, you can go ahead and leave it in. But at any rate, the choke cable, as you can see, there's a piece of rubber over the end of the choke cable. Slide the rubber and the spring out. Slide the choke cable itself through the groove. This portion of rubber goes right between the two halves of this bracket, and then pull so that the outer housing of the choke cable goes back into the rubber piece again. So now it's like this, and the choke cable is refastened. Hold the arm of the choke, and that will go into, put your light right in here, you'll see that there is a small hole right here on the black plastic of the choke arm. This pin has to go through that hole. So you'll slide the carburetor to the end of the studs again and line that pin up so it goes through the holes in that black plastic piece. Now if you look at your choke plate again, when I move this arm, the choke plate moves, so that way you know that you got it back in the right spot. Okay, now there is a drum right here at the top that the choke cable used to go through. We're going to remove the C-clip from the bottom. And I'll show you once I get it off. Okay, so that's the C-clip, and this is the drum. Unfortunately, there was a washer on here that I dropped down in there. I'll have to retrieve that later. That washer is no longer reused, so don't worry if you drop it down in there. But the spring on the choke cable will go into this recessed area, and the cable itself will lay right in here. So you push the spring back, drop the cable in, and now the spring retains it. But at any rate, this is the plunger that we removed from the solenoid body earlier. There used to be a washer on this, and this linkage on the plunger is going to take the place of that washer. That's why that washer is no longer used. So you'll go ahead and take this drum, and you may have to test fit this. On this one here, I've already test fitted it. I know that this linkage is going to have to go below the choke link on the carburetor. On some of them, it may wind up going above it. Generally speaking, it ends up going below it. So you'd put the drum through the linkage, then you'd slide this up from the bottom, and then you'd put your clip in place on the bottom. Let me see if I can do all this without actually dropping the clip. Hopefully I can do it on the second or third attempt without dropping the clip. How ironic, I did it on the first attempt without dropping the clip. If you do drop the clip, it'll fall right down here in the bottom, and you'll have to use a flashlight, a magnet or something like that to pull it back up. But as you can see now, the choke plunger will pull and operate the choke. So now you'll rotate this drum so that this recessed area right here is facing away from you. You'll push the spring back, pull on the cable, slide it into the groove, and then the spring will go into the recessed area in the back. Okay, and that's probably as good a place as any to take a break. Okay, take the metal spacer that we removed earlier, slide it onto the two studs, and look at it from this end and make sure that the outline follows the cutout in the choke bracket. If not, it means you've got this metal spacer on wrong. You'd have to slide it off and either rotate it or flip it or whatever to make sure that it lined up again. But if you've got this cut out in the upper right hand corner and the stud hole in the lower right hand corner like this, that's correct. And as you can see, the choke plate still moves freely. At that time, you would get your air box that you modified by mounting the choke solenoid to the top of. What I do is I fold the air box lid clamps closed, and then take the two wires from the rotary solenoid and tuck them into the air box. What you're going to need to do is take the air box and slide it into the generator, then pull it towards the carburetor, then put the choke plunger into that hole, and then pull it back towards you and then slide it all in. So the first step is we're going to have to slide the carburetor body out to where it's just about to the edge of these studs again. So now we're right on the edge of the studs. Then I'm going to slide it in. Fit the plunger of the choke into the solenoid body. Okay, I just dropped one of the dowels that goes around the studs. And that's probably as good a place to take a break while I find where I dropped that dowel at. Okay, here's the dowel that I heard drop earlier. There are dowels in each of the three holes that mount the airbox in place. This dowel is longer. The two dowels in the top that go around the carburetor are longer than this third dowel that goes down here. So at any rate, you push the dowels back into place. You fold your clips back up again. Put this around it and try one more time. And that's the neat thing about working in your own shop alone, is nobody sees you make mistakes like that unless, of course, you're doing it on a video that's going to be posted on the internet. At which point, you can always edit it out if you want to. I'm not too worried about it. So you put it over the plunger, you pull the airbox back towards you, and then you slide it over the two studs. So now the airbox, the carburetor and everything are in position. There were two 6mm nuts that were removed earlier and one 6mm bolt that hold the airbox into place. So I'm going to put the 6mm bolt in the bottom corner hole. Put the two 6mm nuts over the ends of the stud. And just snug them down with just the socket in my hand. I'm not going to put a ratchet on it yet. And just make sure that it moves freely. And as you can see, I push the choke to the shut position and release it, and it pops all the way open, and that's what you need it to do. Or if you take the choke knob and pull out on it, it chokes it all the way. So at that point, I'm going to take my 1/4-inch ratchet and snug all 3 of the airbox mounts down, starting of course with the bolt in the bottom rear corner, and then snug down the 2 nuts to go onto the studs. Then if you can, you want to look in at this angle and just make sure that everything looks like it's lined up correctly. Generally speaking, if that choke will close all the way and then spring back out all the way, it's lined up correctly. So at this point, you can go ahead and put your breather hose back into place. And that's probably as good a place as any to take a break for a moment. Okay, the next thing is going to be to take the white wire with the female bullet connector that goes to the temperature sensor in the back. And as you remember, there are 2 white wires with male bullet connectors going to the choke solenoid. You can take either one of those white wires and plug one of them into the white wire that goes to the temperature sensor, and make sure that they do engage firmly. And that one is a little extra firmly engaged. Then there is the other white wire that went to the radio. If you come around the front, you can see that there's a grommet where the main harness passes through the heat shield, past this wire through the same grommet, so that it now comes through to this area. Then go back to the choke solenoid and take the other white wire from the choke solenoid and plug it in here. And again, it should be a nice snug fit. And this one is an extremely snug fit also, which is good. It's not going to come apart on us. Then take the wires and tuck them around behind the airbox so that they lay down there with the original stock Honda wires. Come around the back. Make sure that this wire isn't pinched tightly against anything. Have it lay slack like that is perfectly acceptable. And that is probably as good a place as any to take a quick break. Okay, I've got another solenoid plunger out here just to demonstrate this with. When the choke is pulled, it will pull this plunger all the way in. So if you take the choke knob on this and pull out on the choke knob, you'll notice that the plunger goes all the way in so that the center of that pin is just about even with the threaded area. When it's all the way choked, I'm going to go ahead and release the choke. And now we're going to go ahead and test the system. From now on, the generator does not need the manual choke unless the battery is dead, because the electric choke will now activate when the starter motor is activated. So watch the plunger when you do a test on it to make sure that the choke is working correctly. And I'm just going to crank it for a couple seconds. And you'll notice that this one is choking completely. So our electric choke is working, our start solenoid is working, and everything else is working correctly. In fact, if you wanted at this time, take one of the wireless remote key fobs, turn the key to the on position, because the radio is only powered with the key in the on position, extend the antenna on the remote key fob up, slide the pocket protector out of the way so you don't end up accidentally pocket dialing it. But button 1 would engage the starter and the choke solenoid. Then button 2 would shut the generator off. Obviously, because it's not running, it doesn't need to be shut off. Button 3 would turn it in and out of economy mode, but it's not running, so we can't demonstrate that. But at least we have demonstrated that the generator is responding to the radio. And now we can go ahead and start putting it back together. First thing I'll put in is the air filter and the air box lid. And that functions identically to the way it did when it was stock. Fold the clips out of the way. Slide the air filter in place. And we'll put the air box cover in place. And you should hear all 4 of the clamps click shut. Then come around the back. We put the fiberglass cover over the exhaust area. If you look down here, there are 2 metal tabs, one on either side. Make sure that those 2 metal tabs are outside of the fiberglass cover. Those are what hold the fiberglass cover tightly against the generator body. If those 2 tabs are not outside the fiberglass cover, try again. Next step, we're going to put this lower shield in place. And as you remember from the disassembly, that's the cover that's held on with the 4 bolts that are painted black. Next step, we need to install the lift handle. Now it may seem a little bit counterintuitive to put the lift handle on before the exhaust grill, but if the exhaust grill is installed first, you can't get at the bolts to put the lift handle on. And the lift handle is installed with the same 4 bolts that held it on in the first place. Again, we'll go ahead and start all 4 of them and get them down just snug before we go tightening any of them. Probably as good a place as any to take a break for a moment. Okay, the next section is going to be to put the exhaust grill in place, and it's held on by the 4 bolts that held it on originally. And again, I like to start all 4 bolts before tightening any of them down. Then if you just push forward on the grill as you're tightening it down, that way it snugs the fiberglass housing and everything into position on the back of the generator. Next item will be to take the rear plastic cover. Before putting this into place, just make sure that the 4 steel inserts, one on each stud, are in place, and that the foam gasket that goes into this groove is in place. And you set the housing on, and just push it all over the studs. Take 4 of the acorn nuts, and if you're doing the fuel kit at the same time as you're doing the radio kit, note that the acorn nuts that hold the plastic front and rear covers on are the ones with the large flange. The 4 with the small flange hold the small metal cover down on the front. You won't need to worry about that if you're just installing the radio kit alone, but if you're installing the radio kit and the fuel kit at the same time, you may have all the covers off, depending on which order you decide to do things. Okay. Now we come down to the front of the generator. The antenna on this has approximately a 50-inch coax cable running to the antenna. If you're going to be mounting this generator in a generator shed or something like that, where you would like the antenna to be mounted on top of the building, you would leave all this wire extended out of the generator housing. But if you're going to be putting the generator outside, like for camping or whatever, then you would leave most of this wire underneath the front cover and just enough wire to let the magnet stick it to the top of the generator. At any rate, what I recommend doing, let me set this right here for now. The wire comes out of the top of the radio unit, putting a small notch in the cover so that this wire will come around to the front of the cover. This would be the front cover right here. This would be the area that I'm discussing. Right between this stud and the top of this housing, so right through here, grind a small notch with a die grinder. Now would have helped if I remembered to turn the compressor on beforehand. But at any rate, what I'm going to do is I'm going to grind a small notch in the cover above the stud, but below the top of this opening. So right about here, I'm going to put a small notch, just big enough for the antenna wire to fit through. Now, make sure that the foam gaskets are in place all the way around, that the 4 metal spacers are in place. Feed the antenna through this opening. I'm just going to stick it on the gas cap for now. For me, I'm not going to be mounting the generator in a generator shed, so I don't need the antenna wire to run up several feet. So I'm going to take the antenna wire and tuck it right here next to the rest of the wiring harness. Now we're going to go ahead and slide the plastic cover on. Just get it right over the studs. Make sure that we don't crimp any wires as we push it into place. If you come around here, you'll see the notch that we ground right into the housing for the antenna wire to come out through. And the antenna wire comes out through that. So now we can feed the antenna under the lift handle and set it on top of the fuel tank. With that, go ahead and put the 4 acorn nuts in place. And again, I start all 4 of them before tightening any of them down. The last one is the fuel selector valve with a long Phillips head screwdriver. Go ahead and put the fuel selector valve in place. And remember that the shaft on the fuel selector valve goes below the choke cable. If it were to route above the choke cable, it would cause the choke to bind. Right now I've got my hand in there blocking it. Just a minute and I'll show you. Snug that down. Okay, if you look in here, this is the choke cable. Right here. And that black bar below it is the knob for the fuel selector valve. Okay. Now, the only thing left to do is take it outside and test it.